Our topic today is postmodernism. That's a small term, but it's a vast topic. Enormous numbers of volumes have been written on this topic. Tremendous controversy. Almost so much has been written that the term becomes a little bit trivial. And that's really too bad, because what hangs on this is of enormous consequence. Because what many commentators feel as they look about what's happening to our society, what's happening to our world today, is that there is a vast change taking place. An enormous change in the way we think, and the ways in which the kinds of things that we value, and our patterns of relating. And how can we grasp this? How can we know about this change? What can we do about it? And that's not so easy either. That is, what comes next. Because in this change, there are many of us, and I count myself as one of them, who see enormous possibilities of positive consequences, positive possibilities. I look forward in some way with enthusiasm to what may come of this change. For others, it's deeply perilous. It's like watching everything held dear sort of floating out into space, into history. And they want to hold tight and grasp. So I want to talk about this today, but I've got only a short span of time to talk about it. There's no way I can do justice to this field. I could give 10 lectures on it easily and still not exhaust the topic. So we're going to squeeze it down, and what I'm hoping to do is to cover, let's say, some of the high points, some of the important points that often come up in this context, and particularly those that are relevant, let's say, to the field of mental health in general, as most of our viewers are going to be in those fields. Okay, to understand postmodernism, it seems to me you have to go back in time. You have to ask yourself, well, what's modernism? What is modernism and what would be post? And here you have to go back, I think, to 14th, 15th, 16th century, when many historians feel that, at least in Western culture, there was a major change that took place. We moved from a culture as its reason, in which was largely dominated by church, and thus, you might say, a sacred base of culture, to one which was secular, in which the ties to church were moved away. Why that shift that we often call the Enlightenment now, as opposed to the Dark Ages, the Enlightenment? Some people trace it to the rise of a mercantile class, that is another power base, people with money. Others connect it to the rise of kingdoms, where again, there was a lot of money and a lot of power, and a desire to break away from what was looked at as a power hold of the Vatican. One of the interesting things about that change, which is related particularly to the forms of relationship and mental health, was that there took place at that time a kind of a reconceptualization of the person. Now, under the sort of pre-modern condition, we conceptualize the person largely as a spiritual being. That is, the center of my life is a spiritual being, a connection with God. And that spiritual being was largely ruled upon by the church. That is, through confessionals and so on, I was kept pure or in good order. In effect, that conception of the person granted to the church an enormous amount of power over my life. So when you move to the secular base, you kind of had to redefine the nature of the person, because a spiritual center then obviously can't break from the church. So what does it turn out to be? Well, here largely we look at philosophers like Descartes and Locke as providing the grounds for a transformation in the conception of self. So for Descartes, for example, I think, I reason. That's the basis of my knowledge of who I am. That's the only thing I can count on, is my reasoning power. I think. So you've got not I feel the Spirit of God and therefore I exist, but I think and therefore I exist. Whole new way of thinking about people. And you get it at the same time through Locke and others, who usually looked at as empiricists, the notion that, well, I am an observing creature. That is, what I know, my knowledge that I can think with, largely comes from my examination of the world. That is, I look, I observe, I see the world for what it is, and I reason about it. I thus become my own authority. The individual becomes the center of gravity with thought and reason as the base. Now, we owe a lot to that, as I would see it, we owe a lot to that reconception of the person. I think many of the things we value today, many of the institutions, many of our ways of life, are closely connected to that conception of the person. I mean, think of democracy. Don't we value democracy? Democracy is only tenable if you believe that each individual has the capacity to reason for him or herself on the basis of his or her own assessment of the facts. That's moved us away from the royalty as well as a religion. Democracy. Public education. Because a democracy, if we're going to have a democracy, if the government is going to be based on everyone's knowledge and reason, then we need to train knowledge and reason. We need places where people can go to learn knowledge, to learn reason, so that they can contribute to the good society. We need to train everyone. The very conception of individual responsibility and individual rights, okay? Because now we have an individual who reasons and thinks for him or herself, and therefore he or she should be held responsible for his acts, and thus courts of law, in which we're very concerned with whether one knows what they're doing, whether one reasoned through the crime or it just simply happened, as in the difference between, let's say, manslaughter and murder. And individual rights, in which I have the right to vote. I have the right to bear arms. We have rights to our well-being, to be able to choose our own religion, for example. This whole notion of individual rights. Science would be another major manifestation of what this modernist period, dating again from 16th to 17th century to the present. But now science becomes almost, for many people, kind of the epitome of modernism. Because science will argue, look, we can use reason and observation to generate knowledge which we can use in such a way that we can generate continuous improvement. We can know more and more about the world, about ourselves, about culture, about the cosmos, in ways that we can control that world. We can control diseases, we can fly to the moon, we can control heartbreak and disasters of all kinds. We can gain control over those things. Great promise. Science, prosperity, the great move forward. And thus in the 20th century we see the natural sciences turning into social sciences, in which it's not only the natural world we want to know about, but we want to know about people. We want to know about the nature of political systems. We want to know about the nature of the mind. We want to know about the nature of social institutions and so on again, so we can predict and control our future. Now, if you had to put it, let me just touch on four sort of high points or themes that you might take from that. Certainly one of the major ones would be reason. The center of my existence. Observation, as I mentioned. Then we're going to want to put something in there on the nature of ordering. That is, what you use this for as we move up through the 20th century is to gain control over things, of knowing what it is that's taking place, how it functions, and then to do it better. To make a better machine, to fly longer, to move faster, to control more information, to control highway systems, air systems, and so on. What many people have seen as a sort of almost a rage to order, to get it under control. And finally, I'm just going to mention this because it falls out of this in terms of the conception of the person. Largely, the machine, the metaphor of the machine is tremendously important to this picture in terms of what happens in the 20th century under science. That is, we could begin to look at not only the, as it was argued in the 17th century, the cosmos is one great machine, and by that they meant everything is connected to everything through cause-effect relations. So if we could manage to understand all the cause-effect relations, or causal connections, we could know the whole order, we could know the whole machine. Now in the 20th century, the person becomes the machine. That is that which we must understand in terms of the orderly processes on which it operates. Now, I mentioned not only the various sorts of social sciences that emerged in the 20th century, but just think a little bit about psychology for a moment. Most of you will know that, well, psychology went through two major movements in the 20th century. The first movement was called behaviorism, and essentially it looked at the person as a kind of an input-output machine. That is, give the person certain numbers of reinforcements, positive and negative events, or you control the environment in terms of inputs, and you get outputs. So if I have control of, let's say, all the conditions of the development of the human being, I can control the behavior. I can, through, let's say, child-rearing practices and education, produce, like a sausage factory, people who have a certain shape, texture, taste, and then we can standardize that. Standardize the educational procedure because people are input-output machines. That moves on in psychology to another machine later on in the 20th century, to the individual as a computer, that is, as a small computerized information processing system. And so the nature of the research changes a lot to the nature of that processing device. And a great deal of work on, let's say, memory, storage, retrieval, information processing, and so on. Now that machine, in that same way, becomes neural. That is, the whole idea of brain determining behavior. It's just another machine which we can understand, which controls behavior. Enormous consequence. Okay. Now you might say, well, that's all very well and good. Why go anywhere? What's the problem, you might say? Well, many people have felt that something gave way with this whole several hundred years of development. Something bottomed out. Something just wasn't compelling anymore. For a number of commentators, it was a sense that the 20th century had brought with it great failures in what were called the grand narratives. That is, the great stories of progress, of getting better, of what reason and observation will bring us. That this wasn't making sense anymore, because here we had a century which should be the apex of modernism, where everything gets better and better and better. And what do we have? Two major wars, hundreds of thousands of deaths, the creation of an atomic bomb by science, not for the benefit, but for the destruction of humankind. We have capitalism, which brought the Great Depression. Well, that wasn't just obviously working. And it seemed that one case after another, and the last one would be communism. I mean, communism was a quintessential modernist byproduct. As communism was grounded in the notion that after studying all of the economic behavior of people, working through all of the data about that economy, capitalism doesn't work. Communism is the great move forward, and we can establish a whole culture, whole country, vast nation on the basis of a rational model. And that scarcely lasts, a century. It decays. So horror, disappointment, destruction, defeat, all seem wrapped up. One couldn't hold on to these things as really being somehow promising for the future. And if you look at just mental health for a moment, what does it get us to look at the person as a machine in the mental health field? Well, it means take anybody who's having a severe problem, get them off the street, get them into what amounts to a cell, and then you can lobotomize them, that is, just change their brain, or you can give them electroshock. And so here you've got what look now, and as we look back at them, almost terrorist-like institutions which take people out of their homes, put them in places where horrible things are done to them as if that's going to be better for them, and they don't get better. Mostly they stay there. Now there's another story to tell, and I've told that story in a book called The Saturated Self, about the shift to postmodernism, which largely goes back to what might be looked at as the communication explosion of the 20th century. And as there you've also got a century in which the emergence of the telephones we didn't have allow you to communicate all over the place. Now up into cell phones where it's 24/7, reachable by hundreds. Development of the radio, which allowed voices from far distant places now to come into one's life, and now carried on the internet where you can reach radio stations all over the world. Development of television. Not only is you're going to hear the voices, you're going to have the people in your room there on the screen. And that's now transformed into 300, 400 channels that one can pick up again from all over the world. Development of jet transportation, the airplane up through jet transportation, which allows people to be virtually anywhere in the world tomorrow, around the world, halfway around the world, and vast numbers of people moving. And this is to say nothing of the advent of the internet, the World Wide Web, email, and texting, and so on and so on. Gadgets of various sorts, which again, where communication just becomes profuse, where every day we are inundated by hundreds of ideas and messages and people and images, and we can flip through a dozen, 50 channels and get things from all over the world, sports from here, or fire from there, or murder from there, or story from there, and so on. And it's global, it just moves globally. Now, what would be the result of that? Well, first of all, this great feeling that, hey, modernism kind of failed us. And then the sense that there's all this motion of ideas and people and images and visions and opinions and values circulating with us every day. Now, at that point, you have to begin to wonder about several things. Reason. Well, wait a minute, who's saying what good reasoning is? Because I've got, let's say about any topic, let's say a news topic, I've got not just one reason, I've got a dozen talking heads, and that story may go on and on and on for 3 weeks, with everybody having an opinion from one, when they all sound pretty good, not very bad, never thought of it that way, but it's just a continuous outpouring of reason. And whose are we to trust? What would be the reason? If we have 15 theories of economy about what we should do next in terms of economic policy, which theory do you trust? Whose theory is it? The reason, as a kind of epitome of something that we should strive for, as if there is one logic to which we all might attain or strive, just becomes an empty idea after a while. And you slowly begin to realize that it's it's not reason in itself. It's not pure reason. It's not pure logic that we're faced with. But what we have are conventions. Social conventions of reason. Conventions of reason. Now, I want to stop here for a moment because for many people this seems to be a great loss. That is, well, wait a minute, what happened to the sole individual as a reasoning agent? What we've done here is to place the emphasis on conventions. Because within the postmodern spectrum, you begin to realize that individuals in themselves, that is this Cartesian thinker or observer in the Lockean sense, are a problem. What would be there in reason without other people? Could one think about the environment, politics, religion without some kind of set of words? And where are those words going to come from but one's participation in social traditions or conventions, traditions of reason. So we move then from an individual-centered base of thought to one which is far more social. And conventions may sound sort of, I just don't want to do conventional things, but look at it this way. If we look at them as conventions, we see nothing that is said, no reasonable statements need necessarily stand. So whatever reasoning traditions we're in, if they don't work for us, we can suspend them. We can create something else. There's no hard and fast tradition of reasoning to which we must have allegiance. They can be decomposed, deconstructed, and the invitation there is for freedom, creativity. Let us think together about alternatives. Now, observation. Well, aren't there just facts in themselves, things that are just there? Well, again, you get into the notion that yeah, but here we have a whole lot of different voices about this, and what constitutes fact for one is not for another. I mean, here we have a whole array of factual reporting on the news, and depending on where you are, some seem biased, but if you're here, that seems biased. If you're there, that seems biased. The middle seems just to be, take all the biases and cover them. So who's fact? Now, what I want to suggest here is that there is a move, and this is not going to be understandable as I write it up, but hold it for a moment, toward a passionate pragmatism. Now, what does that mean? Let's take the fact of me. What is the fact? Now, if you're, let's say, my doctor, the facts are pretty clear for you. I'm a biological specimen, and what you're going to be interested in are my heart condition, my liver, my lungs, and my hormones, and my muscles, and my lymph, and so on. No problem. However, if you were, let's say, if I were religious and you were my priest, you'd be still very concerned about the nature of my spiritual condition, which for you is a factual matter, not make-believe. And if you were the person who cuts my hair, you might think, well, the fact of the matter is this is going to be a really easy job. Not going to take long. I'll make a lot of money in a short time. If you are gay, the fact of me is going to be different than if you're heterosexual. If you're black, the fact of me is going to be different than if you are Asian. And so on. Now, what is this to say? It's to say that whatever facts are, they're always from some conventional, traditional base, that is. But we use them for things. We use those languages for something. That is the pragmatism. And we use them for the values that we bring into the situation. That is the passions. For example, my doctor, in terms of passion, the values of that doctor are to keep me well, to keep me, to give me longevity. That's his passion. The language of hormones and limbs and liver and so on are the facts for him given those particular values. Now, the priest would have a far different set of values, that is wanting to save my soul, for example, and for him the language of spirit is going to mean a lot. Similarly, my hairdresser, for him or her, the passion is to make me look good and to make a profit from that, because he or she has to live. So there's something he or she wants to do, and it's based on the values. The facts are not just pure facts just out there. Facts are created within social groupings to do something. And similarly with science itself. That is, all scientists have some value in terms of something they want to accomplish. They want to be able to predict something, for example. And that language of science is going to be based on the desire to predict those things. Now that's all very well and good, but that doesn't give science, in this sense, some kind of upper hand as if that's the apex of what we should be striving for, because science does some things well, that is pragmatically well, given its values, but not all things. And many would say, look, the whole scientific establishment has been kind of the death knell of talk about values. Because science wants to talk about what is the case and not what ought to be the case. And so you get a whole kind of deterioration of philosophy of morality and discussions of the good within educational institutions. Typical sort of stereotype of the scientist is, look, you want me to make an atomic bomb? I don't care who I work for. I'm just trying to make something that people want and need. Not my job to question the good of it, even though many scientists do. Okay, ordering. Now again, once you realize this massive number of voices, what happens to the order? Well, you realize that, look, if there are people always in communication, generating conventions of reasoning, having different values of what counts, what they want to do with their language, and to have one order, that is to bring it all together, just isn't the way to go. Because that, whatever ordering you have for some other people, at some time is going to be like a straitjacket. It's going to be like imperialism. So don't bank on ordering, bank on something that you look at as sort of a transformation. Of a continual sort. That is, we must be prepared continuously for the transformation of culture, of values, of institutions, and so on, as they incorporate other voices. And the machine metaphor, or person, which seems again to have this quality of closing down on what the human being is. So say, let's open up that space. But we know that social conventions are important in terms of not only reason, but what counts as fact. Let's look at metaphors that are more relational. The metaphor of a conversation, for example. not what I am that's sort of in there as a reason, and it's not what's there as a spirit. It's what's there as I am engaged in conversations with others, out of which the very concepts of reason and fact will emerge. And extricated from conversation, I am nothing. I am in relationship, therefore I am. Without relationships, there is nothing. Again, there's a lot to be unpacked there in that small set of phrases. I'm just trying to give you a sense of that movement. Just trying to find other metaphors for what it is people are that sort of take account of not only the sense that we can't continue to live in a modernist world, we've got to somehow take into account the vast range of values and reasons that people create within the world. And somehow we've got to bring them together in conversation, and we need a conception of the person which enables us to do that. Okay, I'm just about finished right now. I want to say just a couple of other things. One of them just touched lightly on mental health, and a lot more to be said about this. But as you move from a machine-like view to a relational view of mental health, it is first of all to question the notion that there are some kind of authorities who have, by virtue of reason and observation, have the right to call the machine, that is, for example, the diagnostic categories, which science, in terms of psychiatry and clinical psychology, for example, have used to put people into categorical boxes. Well, wait a minute, what's the pragmatic value of that? Why are we doing that? Who is that helping? Does it really help the person to put them in a category? Could it be otherwise? Can we think that anew? Can we have another conversation about it? And it's to say, let's look at therapy not as the knowing therapist who knows everything virtually about you and what must be wrong with you, whether it be a childhood problem or whether it be a problem in your cognitive functioning before you ever got in the office, or could we look at therapy as a kind of relationship which yields transformation? Why participate as therapists with you toward creative transformation? And I lay stress here on the creativity involved there. That is, not knowing in advance about the outcome, but searching for viable forms of reason, viable forms of pragmatics, which work for the person. Well, again, there's a lot more to be said there and will be said, but that'll at least give a sense of pause for what's involved here. I just want to finish out by talking just briefly again about the larger perils and promise with postmodernism, because again, as you could perhaps imagine, many people see this as a threat. The threat to, for one, the notion that there can be secure knowledge, that we can know right from wrong, that we can know what is the case. Because this says, look, anytime you state what is the case, you're only doing it from a particular perspective with particular values in mind, so you've got to be prepared for transformation. To stay in the space is in some way to draw a ring around yourself and relationship breaks down. So there's a way in which, yeah, it's a peril. If you want to hold dear to anything and you don't want it to change, probably it will be destroyed. Because the world will continue to move, conversations will continue to move, and it will become outmoded, unreal, and non-viable. Now the promise is, to me, if we've got a globe in which there are multiplicities of values, reasons, facts, and so on operating, if we somehow could break down the notion that there are the facts, the values, the religion, the political system, which must be the best and the only, which is to say the move into the postmodern, maybe there's some kind of hope in the conversations that we would have. Maybe it wouldn't simply be an argument of my way of life against your way of life. That is, arguments being based on the notion of a right and a wrong. And we could move to something like transformational conversations, forms of dialogue, which would allow some transformations, yielding what we might call a more viable way of living, not only in societies, but with nature as well. So that's my hope. Thank you.